Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West, and we're happy to have you here for another one of our scholars. We welcome back, and can I call you an old friend? Adele Morris, who some of you have been coming regularly may recognize. Adele is very involved in our activities here, both in the classroom and with colleagues across the state on energy and economic issues. She'll tell you a little bit about that in the course of her talk. Adele is very well versed and has a global perspective on this issue. She's worked in the State Department, with Treasury, with the Joint Economic Committee of Congress on climate and energy issues. So we're very fortunate to have her here on a topic that has been addressed in the campaign in various ways. And tonight, however, you'll get the facts on all this issue. Adele?
Thanks, Bill. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank my hosts at Brookings Mountain West. I've been a Brookings Mountain West fellow now for several years, and I've really enjoyed coming out here and speaking with you and with the students in various classes and talking to folks, and it's a great opportunity to be here tonight. I want to give a little shout out to a couple faculty members who are here that I've been working with. Brad Wimmer is teaching one of the Brookings Mountain West courses for the new minor that UNLV is offering. He's doing the economics class. I was just talking with some of his students yesterday, and I'll be talking with them again tomorrow. So thank you, Brad, for your contribution to Brookings Mountain West. And Helen Neal is here, and she and I have an economic research project going on looking at how gasoline prices can affect property values within Clark County. So good to see Helen here. And I recognize some of the students who I've talked to already this week, so thanks for coming out. And so luckily this topic is different than what you heard. You might see some of the same ideas, but it'll still be a little bit different. Okay, so the work I'm going to show you today is written up in a couple places. What kind of got me started in this work, looking at clean energy technology policy, is a project I was doing with two other Brookings senior fellows, Pietro Nivola, who's in our governance studies program, and Charlie Schultz, who's a colleague of mine in the economic studies program. We have a paper coming out in energy economics. Actually, it's already out. Came out last month. There's a discussion paper version of that online at brookings.edu. You're welcome to look at that if you can't get enough. And there's also sort of a shorter op-ed type version on my webpage at brookings.edu. So I'm going to start from first principles about clean energy technology. And the way I want to frame this is you're talking to an economist, so I'm giving you kind of the economist version about why you should care about clean energy technology. If you have a policy, what should your objectives be? What makes economic sense, okay? I'm going to start out with kind of laying the groundwork for what we do. I'm looking at federal government involvement in clean energy, and I'm looking at primarily at subsidies of one kind or another. And I want to just look at how fiscally significant is this? What are our investments and what have they been over time? And why should the government intervene? In what way, if we left markets to decide what technologies might be deployed, in what way would markets get it wrong in some economic sense? And then if we do think markets are going to have an inefficient outcome left to their own devices, what is it the government could do to intervene efficiently, cost effectively, to address those policy endpoints? That's kind of the big framework. So in order to quantify what we invest in clean energy, we kind of got to say something about what do we mean by clean energy. And we all have this intuitive sense, well, it means probably low carbon, low greenhouse gas emissions, low environmental impacts generally. If we want to think about life cycle impacts, We might care not just about the fuels we use and what happens when we combust them, but what happens to any of the waste or whatever that might be involved. And then it's not just the energy. We might also want to put energy efficiency in there as well, because as they say, the cleanest energy is the energy we don't produce, right? So if we have more efficient economy in terms of energy, that can be good for the environment as well. So, okay, that's the intuition, but in practice it's more complicated because there are a lot of technologies some people might think are clean and other people might not. And a lot of it, when you talk about clean, it's clean relative to what, right? Is it relative to coal? Is it relative to some perfection standard? What do we mean by clean? And some obvious examples might include nuclear. Do you think that's clean? Well, it certainly doesn't have the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it that coal does, but a lot of people might be worried about impacts from nuclear waste. So they wouldn't call it clean. Other people would use different criteria. Clean coal, you've heard the debates talking about, well, coal's not clean. Yes, it is. No, it's not. In there, you're really talking about which pollutant are you talking about. Clean coal can be made clean from the perspective of what we call criteria air pollutants, SO2, particulate matter, mercury. You can scrub that stuff out of the waste stream. The key is the greenhouse gases. And are you worried about the CO2 in the waste stream? And if you want coal to be clean from a greenhouse gas perspective, you have to strip the CO2 out of the waste stream of gases and pump it underground or do something to store it and keep it from the atmosphere. So clean depends on your definition, what pollutants you're talking about. Natural gas is very good from a criteria air pollutant standard. Very little mercury, SO2, particulate matter, really clean relative to coal from that perspective. But it's still got greenhouse gases. It's just about half as much per BTU as coal. That's my little bar chart over there. So again, clean relative to what? And new hydropower, okay? We have existing hydropower. People don't generally squabble about that. So should we build more hydropower? Again, not so much CO2, but big local environmental impacts and changing the hydrology and ecosystems of rivers and all that stuff. Some people view that as high environmental impact and therefore not clean. So if you want to have a subsidy, you got to think, I believe, clean or not clean as a binary variable doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, what is your actual problem you're trying to address? And think about it specifically in those terms. Now, there are so many different ways you could promote clean energy. And here's a few categories. Obviously, you can do direct subsidies. You can do tax credits or tax subsidies of one kind or another. We have that for some biofuels, some of which just expired. Production tax credit for wind, that kind of thing. So it's a subsidy in the sense it's foregone revenue, right? So it's money the government's not taking in that it otherwise would. A risk transfer, as an example of that, would be if we limited the liability of a nuclear power plant and said, you nuclear firms are going to only bear a certain amount of liability should something go wrong. Okay, that's a transfer of risk from the firms to the federal taxpayers or whoever would be involved in cleaning up an incident. Okay? Any kind of insurance or implied credit towards risk would be that kind of thing. Direct regulation, we can mandate clean energy. We've talked about that. Some states have already mandated clean energy through a renewable portfolio standard. And that was discussed at the federal level, although it didn't go anywhere. You could have an input subsidy. And this is an example right here. This is an artist's rendering of a big solar project that's been proposed, and it would be on federal land, okay? So there the government is providing land for a renewable energy project. So they didn't have to go out and procure private land for that project. And then you can think about the government as kind of a anchor tenant or a buyer of renewable energy or clean energy in some way. We do that. We have actually in the federal government, you need to buy a certain number of hybrid vehicles, or you have to buy a certain amount of biofuels, and the Navy's working on that for the ships. So you can think about that as a potential subsidy, although it depends. The actual monetary value of the subsidy is not always clear, because you don't know how much they would have spent had they not had the requirement. But in any case, it is a way of promoting clean energy. So we have a whole bunch of different policies that kind of move towards clean energy endpoint. We do a lot of basic research. We have our national labs that do energy research of various kinds. We also fund academic research. And I don't know, maybe some of you folks have had some kind of grant related to the government. And then I mentioned the production tax credits. We also have mandates for how much biofuels need to be blended with gasoline, and there's some technical issues involved in expanding those. We have programs that assist low-income households for their energy efficiency investments, and that was one thing that was expanded in the stimulus package. We require appliance manufacturers to provide information about, have you guys ever seen that Energy Star thing? Okay, or like you go to buy a refrigerator and there's a big label. Okay, the appliance manufacturers are required to provide that information. It's a way of promoting energy efficient appliances. And then we have a cap and trade program for acid rain. That's the sulfur dioxide program. And you may have heard something about the loan guarantee programs for various kinds of technologies, including solar, and a lot of that went to nuclear as well. So how big is this? So we're going back to the fiscal footprint of clean energy. In 2007, it was around $18 billion of various kinds of energy spending or foregone tax revenue. And by 2010, it was up to closer to $37 billion. A lot of that increase was the stimulus package, and a lot of that spending is going back down as a result of the closure of that stimulus package. And it's all sorts of different things. It's electricity, it's transportation, and it's energy efficiency. And it's a little bit of everything. Electricity and fuels used for electricity were two of the big parts of the stimulus package. And then also the conservation was a big part of that too. So how big are these subsidies? Well, it depends on how you measure it. If you measure it as a share of the BTUs or kilowatt hours produced, they can be pretty big. So so this is a chart of where how our electricity is produced. Okay, you can see coal is a little over 40%, and natural gas is about a quarter. And that natural gas slice has been expanding as the price of natural gas has come down. The availability of gas is edging out coal, both because it's become cheaper relative to coal, and also because there are some Clean Air Act rules that have been implemented, not necessarily for CO2, but for other pollutants. And remember I said natural gas tends to be cleaner for all those other pollutants. So an amalgam of those two factors has been driving an expansion of natural gas relative to coal-fired electricity. Nuclear hasn't changed much, although its share is kind of going down. What's interesting is renewables loom large, but as a share of electricity, right now it's pretty small. It's about not quite 5%, and there's the breakdown. And you hear a lot about solar, but in terms of kilowatt hours, it's really small. And most of the subsidies I was talking about apply to that green slice right there. So a lot of that was concentrated. And the petroleum guys are quick to point out that if you compare it on a kilowatt hour basis, these subsidies were vastly higher for renewables than they were for fossil fuels. And so there's this debate around, well, we need to subsidize clean because we've subsidized fossil and so on. And to some extent that's true, but also the existing subsidies are very targeted towards renewables right now, particularly on a per BTU basis. So let's look at the tax expenditures. Now, these are a little more obscure because it's hard to see foregone revenue, but the budget implications are the same thing. And you can see that this is all energy-related stuff. So the green is fossil fuels. That didn't go up so much in the stimulus package, but you can see the renewables, like I was talking about. See that big spike? That's the stimulus spending on renewables. A lot of that is deployment of new renewable electricity capacity. So what I was saying before in terms of kilowatt hours generated was a little bit unfair because some of that is investment in new capacity that didn't go into the denominator I was talking about before. And then, okay, so another category is research and development. Again, similar spiky profile. And I really want to make a point about research because this is not how you fund research. If what you really want is new results, you know, methodical transition to an efficient set of technologies, throwing a bunch of money at research for 1 or 2 years and then nearly cutting it off entirely is not the right way to fund research in a sensible way. You know, all you do is you bid up the price of inputs. And then, I mean, because there's only so many people who can do research at any given time. So now I understand why they did it, because it was part of the stimulus. And yeah, I guess if you're a faculty member, get it while you can. But from a national policy perspective, this is not a really sensible trajectory for research. It should probably be higher, but it shouldn't be highly variable. So, okay, so that's kind of the lay of the land. And now let's go into the arguments for clean energy policy. So there's a whole host of them, and you heard them in the debates and so on. So I only have an hour, so I'm going to kind of narrow in on a few of them. I'm going to pick 3 of them. Greenhouse gas emissions, and the fact that clean energy is lower in those. Energy security, you've heard a lot about energy independence and that kind of stuff. And the idea that there's some kind of industrial strategy we could have. Like, we need to invest in clean energy because if we don't, the Chinese will, and they're going to eat our lunch, and we're going to lose global market share and all that. I'm going to go in and kind of examine that sort of argument. And what I want to do is look for kind of rational economic arguments for this policy and distinguish that from, I'm a solar company and I want a subsidy and help me out, okay? So we're looking for public policy motivations other than that. So let's see how they line up to actual, remember I was talking about we're going to look for ways that markets left to their own devices are going to get it wrong, okay? So that's my category on the right-hand side, market failures, something that's going to have some macroeconomic or environmental problem. So my first thing about environmental damages from conventional energy, that goes to 2 kinds of market failures. External costs, which means when I put gasoline in my car, that price doesn't reflect the environmental damages that come from combusting that gasoline. So that means that gasoline is not priced efficiently because I'm not fully bearing the full social cost of the gasoline I use. And therefore I overconsume relative to what the social optimum would be. And then public goods, that's the research and development I was talking about before. There's a market case or an economic case for the government to invest in technologies that wouldn't necessarily be provided efficiently by private firms acting alone. Okay, energy security, I'm going to translate that into economic language. Yeah, so instead of kind of a vague thing about, well, we have to fund our Navy and oil producing something, I'm gonna narrow in on the macroeconomic risk from volatile oil prices. And what does that cost? And what could we do cost effectively to address it? Okay, and finally, the strategic industrial or trade potential. There's really not an economic efficiency story there. Rather, it says that we can tilt the playing field in our direction if we take on certain policies or investments. Okay, so it's a distributional story. It's not, we're going to make markets more efficient. We're going to tilt markets in the benefit of Americans relative to everybody else. So how strong are they? Let's go through them. 1, 2, 3. Rationale 1, environmental damages. So this is a news flash. I'm going to say the reason we care about clean energy is that it's clean. Okay? I think that is the absolute strongest case to care about clean energy relative to other kinds of energy. Now, I mentioned the example of gasoline. Any kind of fuel is going to have some kind of external cost. What the idea is that you want to be sure that all those costs are priced in. So what does that mean? That would mean putting a price on that environmental outcome. Well, what would you do? You would have to put a tax on carbon, wouldn't you? To internalize those external costs. So already I'm getting off track politically in a bad way, because I'm going to say that we shouldn't implicitly subsidize fuels by not pricing the full social costs. Okay? Make me pay what my gas is really costing society. So what is that cost? And that would be a whole other lecture on how to monetize the climatic disruptions and ecological outcomes and human health and flooding of sea level rise and the existence of polar bears in the wild and all that stuff. I'm gonna punt, and I'm gonna just point to one set of estimates that was done by the Obama administration interagency team, estimating that the price on carbon is the social cost of carbon is somewhere between about $5 and $65 a ton. So if you were to put a tax on CO2 of somewhere in that range, there's a good chance you'd be getting it more or less right. Although not everybody agrees with this. A lot of people think the damages are much higher. I'm not sure you'd get a higher tax than that passed. I think you'd be lucky to get something in that range. Okay, so I'm an economist. I have to talk about marginal something. So this is a marginal abatement cost. And the idea is that the first few tons that you abate, so this is pollution mitigation going to the right. The first few tons are pretty cheap. That's where you're doing your energy efficiency. That might even save you money, right? The vertical axis is dollars per ton. How much does it cost? So the next few tons start to get a little bit more expensive. I'm assuming you're rank ordering these things and you're starting from the cheapest first. Let's assume we got that far. Okay, and then maybe you're switching from coal to natural gas. And then a little bit higher, you're starting to deploy wind power, and then solar power. And then up there, you're just shutting down your economy. Okay, so you can reduce emissions all you want. You just have to figure out how far up that curve you're willing to go. And that's where you have to balance the costs and benefits of action. So this is if we had a tax. And let's just say it's $20 a ton, something like the central estimate of the Obama team. I think theirs was like 23. And that's what you would get. You would abate up until the point where the tax, it's cheaper to pay the tax than to cut emissions. Okay, and then you'd get that green rectangle in revenue. How many remaining emissions times the price per unit of emissions. Now, if we didn't like that and we wanted to abate further, we'd have to raise the tax. We'd increase the total cost of abatement, the blue triangle, gets bigger. And the green triangle might get bigger or smaller depending on what happens to the price relative to the quantity, right? So you have to multiply the two, okay? But where am I going with this? I'm going to technology. So if we were able to have better technology, what we'd be saying is we can get more abatement for the same cost. So all else equal, it's better to have that red abatement curve falling below so that you get, so it's cheaper to accomplish your goals. So technology really is very important, and not just the existence of it, but the cost of it. Because as long as the cost is lower, you're gonna get to your goals cheaper. So if you have a price on carbon, you're gonna induce that technology development. It doesn't make sense to say we're gonna have a price on carbon, yet we have to subsidize deployment of renewables because they already became more competitive when you put the price on carbon. But you still need to do the R&D, like I said. Basic research is gonna get underprovided. Now, sort of more commercial level deployment is now gonna become a better investment, and you don't necessarily need to subsidize that if you have a price on carbon. But there's no natural connection. You don't need to take that whole big green rectangle and spend it on energy because the price signal does that for you. And you can use that revenue to reduce other taxes or reduce the deficit or rebate it to households. In some of our research, we've shown that if you have a carbon tax, and you take the revenue and you reduce other taxes on investing and saving, you can actually get a net benefit to GDP. So, okay, that's all fine, well and good. Yeah, we could have a carbon tax. What dream world are you in? What do you do if you don't have a price on carbon? So in that case, what you should do is, what would you do? What would happen in the economy if there was a price on carbon? Okay? The government policy could try to mirror what would happen. It would be starting at that low cost abatement. You wouldn't go straight to the high cost abatement. If you were going to use your incremental federal dollar, you should get as much abatement per dollar spent as possible, right? So let's say we were going to try to subsidize abatement. We would do it for the cheapest opportunities, okay? That doesn't mirror what we've been spending, okay? We spend a lot of money on technologies that are relatively high cost abatement. Now, a certain amount of that in a research context makes sense, but it doesn't make any sense in a deployment context. So until we have a price on carbon, try to mirror what would happen, what were the low cost abatement, and where it pertains, stop subsidizing traditional fossil fuels. And that's a whole nother lecture too. So, well, why don't we have tax credits for energy efficient stuff? And maybe we could do that. Well, we modeled it. And what we found is if you compare two policies, one that subsidizes energy efficient appliances and other household capital, new stuff, obviously, and another that just puts a price on carbon, and you look at two of those policies that have roughly the same size fiscal footprint, but the subsidy is an expenditure and the tax is a revenue. So you have to tax people to fund the subsidy, or you have to rebate the tax back to households in a lump sum manner. So we did this in our model, and what we found that this is carbon emissions relative to business as usual. And the tax credit got us a tiny slice. You may not even be able to detect it relative to business as usual emissions. Very small departure. Whereas a carbon tax just plunged emissions. Now, why would that be? Well, it goes to the nature of those incentives. The tax on carbon instantly affects the incentives on utilizing all existing capital, right? if my electricity prices go up because I have coal-fired electricity, then I have the incentive to not just replace my existing appliances, but to use them less, right? Same thing for my gas. I don't have to buy a new car. I can drive my car less. And so the tax does that. It works through all existing capital and not just the deployment of new capital. And it also affects what fuels the electricity generators are going to choose. A subsidy for appliances and other household capital doesn't affect the fuel decisions. In fact, that's one of the biggest lower cost ways to reduce emissions is through fuel switching. And then another kind of more subtle thing is if I suddenly have less energy bills, I have more money left over to spend on other things, some of which will be energy, direct or indirect. So, okay, so I would say to conclude that rationale, what you care about is the environmental outcome, price that directly. If you can't do that, undertake policies that mirror what would have happened had you done that as you wait for a political environment that can kind of deal with that rationally. So, number 2, energy security. So, okay, we've all seen those political ads where there's some politician standing in front of windmills as the sun goes down, and then some kind of melodic voiceover says something about how we need wind because it reduces our dependence on foreign oil or something like that, right? You've seen those. Well, okay, this is how our electricity is generated. How much of that is oil? 1%. So wind power is not relevant to oil. And that's what we import. When we talk about energy security, all that other stuff is domestic or North American already. Coal, we're a net exporter of coal. Natural gas, we're talking about becoming a net exporter of natural, or we're exporting natural gas. Nuclear, domestic. Hydropower, domestic or North American. Okay, so the story about energy security is 100% a story about oil, which is a 0% story about electricity. Now, okay, if you want to quibble, there are some linkages perhaps through the natural gas market and so on, but you have to get through a pretty lengthy chain of logic to get an electricity story about energy security. So if it's about oil, what are our options? So we can do biofuels, we can do electric cars. You get to the question of, how do you generate the electricity, but that's domestic. Natural gas, you can do natural gas vehicles. Getting at energy security is complicated because you might be able to increase your domestic production or North American production more broadly. Most of what we've done, in addition to ethanol, is trying to emphasize fuel economy, just reduce the gas required for a vehicle mile traveled. Now, the electric car thing, I don't see how we're going to get much in the way of environmental improvements or even much in the way of reduced oil consumption from our program. But what we have is a $7,500 tax credit for electric cars. You can get one of those Teslas. You can buy it down from about $100,000 to about closer to $93,000 with your tax credit. And that's our program. Now, I mean, I don't know how much we're shifting out the demand for electric cars to get them down to $93,000 a piece, but that's the effect of our policy. So what are the likely costs and considerations in this? Well, we talk about energy self-sufficiency. That's usually what people are talking about when they say energy security. North American energy independence, you've heard that, right? So even if we were self-sufficient, we're still vulnerable to the swings of world oil prices, right? Because it's a fungible commodity. So if there's any kind of swings going on from foreign demand or supply shocks, we're going to feel them, because it's not as though energy suppliers are going to want to charge us a lower price than everybody else, right? Another challenge is that we really only worry about these price shocks when they happen. The rest of the time, prices are relatively stable. It's not a macroeconomic issue. And these substitutes are expensive. And for example, with ethanol, if we want to push out production of ethanol, we might be pushing up food prices through corn markets and all the knock-on effects of that. And we also have to get cars that can accept higher ratios of ethanol in the blend of gasoline. And right now, the cars can't do that, and we've hit what's called a blending wall. And a lot of these oil substitutes aren't necessarily clean. Like ethanol could have a lot of environmental impacts in terms of the production and consumption, or the production, processing, and shipping of the fuel. And certainly coal to liquids, do you guys remember that? That was a long time ago. Coal to liquids was very greenhouse gas intensive. And then finally we have to ask, how vulnerable are we to those shocks? I just want to, real quickly about the imports. Our imports are going down of petroleum, and they're projected to continue to go down. And these are projections from the Energy Information Administration. You can see we've been importing less, partly because our own production has gone up faster than consumption has. And where do we get that oil? Well, we get less and less of it from OPEC and more of it from Canada. So you have to ask yourself, how much more does the government need to intervene to accelerate the existing trends? And would it make sense to try to do that? But I would say, in conclusion, there's two reasons you care about these macroeconomic spikes. One is whatever foregone income there is as a result of those higher prices. But two is what is happening to broader price levels as those higher oil prices pass through the economy. And we have a tool for that. It's called the Federal Reserve. And by far the most cost-effective way to deal with those macroeconomic price shocks is through the monetary policy system rather than, subsidies for biofuels or something like that. So I think there's plenty of things to critique on both sides of the aisle in terms of energy security. Finally, let's look at clean energy investments that could benefit Americans relative to everyone else. And you hear this, we got to invest in clean energy because these other countries are doing it, and therefore we should do it, and if we don't do it, then they're going to get this market share. This is a very widely held belief, and it's consistent with a long line of industrial policy arguments. At one point it was a concern about the Japanese and cars, remember that, and electronics, and every few years one of these things kind of pop up. Well, I would say that subsidies are a tough way to create comparative advantage, because if you don't have an intrinsic commercial comparative advantage and you're relying on a subsidy, that is a risky business strategy, because you're relying on fickle government policy to provide your business case. I think I'm not saying don't do it, I'm just saying that as a business model, it carries some downside risks relative to other business models. And finally, this idea that we're going to create jobs. Well, look, we have a labor pool. I'm abstracting a little bit from a sharp economic downturn, but in normal economic conditions, what you're going to do is you're going to move jobs to clean energy away from something else. And you're going to do it by spending taxpayer dollars. It's a hard case. I'm not aware of peer-reviewed economic literature that says clean energy subsidies are going to create jobs on net across the economy over the long run. I mean, it's just a really tough case to make, and I haven't seen the evidence of it. Another argument is that if we go first, we're going to get some kind of edge. Well, actually, we may not get an edge by going first, because then we're incurring more of the risk technologically and market-wise, right? If the Chinese want to make solar panels cheaper and they're willing to take the risk and the hit to their budget, you know, is there necessarily a reason to stop them? And in addition, we want clean energy to be as cheap as possible. And if they want to subsidize their solar panels, okay, again, I'm not a solar panel maker, so you can tell that's, you know, key to my perspective. But if they want to make environmental improvements cheaper for us, then we should take advantage, right? Now, you do want to have a system whereby you feel like the trading, the rules of trade are fair. So if they are dumping or violating WTO, you're not going to just sit around. But from an environmental perspective, you know, it could well be the case that others investing first could benefit us. Well, what about this idea of creating jobs? Like let's say we are in a downturn. I would argue clean energy subsidies fail on most of the grounds for judging fiscal stimulus as effective or not effective. The criteria we use: timely, temporary, and targeted. Okay, timely, can you get it out there and get it in place? Well, I'm not so sure that subsidizing, you know, cash for clunkers, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's timely. Is it targeted? I'm not sure that really necessarily created a lot of jobs, because what happened is people just moved forward their purchase of automobiles. As soon as the program was done with, they purchased fewer automobiles than they otherwise would. You had maybe a little bit of intertemporal transfer of demand for vehicles, but on net, it's hard to see what you accomplished, especially for a protracted recession. You're subsidizing new capacity right at the time where you don't even need the new capacity because your economy's gone down. We already talked about R&D. You know, do R&D because we need R&D, not because we think it's counter-cyclical spending. And I don't know how many, you know, legions of unemployed mechanical engineers there were in the recession, but I don't think there was just a whole pool sitting around not doing anything until we had stimulus. And finally, I just don't think that a lot of this spending as fiscal stimulus was going to do much to keep these firms competitive over the long run. And we're already seeing that some of these firms are not doing well. And, you know, it's not because I'm against clean energy, it's just you can't fund a business model with sort of wishful thinking about what the market is. And again, I go back to you need a price on carbon to stimulate demand for those products. You can't just push on supply and do nothing about demand. Finally, there's theory versus practice. So, okay, even if you had the theory right, how it actually works is often a function of, you know, which congressman sits on which committee and what firms they have in their district. And, you know, none of that is an economically sensible way to allocate society's scarce resources. So, you know, maybe you need an independent group to try to politically neutrally identify the investments where the money would be best spent. But the history of these things is littered with fiascos. And really, even if they're well-intended, right? Do you guys remember the hydrogen economy? We were supposed to have a hydrogen economy. I don't see any hydrogen economy, right? So it's not just the Democrats. It's like a whole history of one kind of boondoggle versus another. And again, they're well-intentioned. It's not like people said, I'm going to go out and waste a bunch of taxpayer money. It's like, hey, we think this is going to be a fruitful investment, and it just doesn't work out that way. So to conclude, I think the rationale for clean energy is it's clean. We care about these environmental endpoints. We should do something directly to address the environmental endpoints, and then clean energy should take care of itself for the most part, and put a price signal on greenhouse gases. That I would put that by far at the top of my list of what to do to promote clean energy. And without it, there's just no way to subsidize the deployment of this technology to the degree necessary to really achieve the environmental goals that we've contemplated. And then when you're looking at R&D and what those federal investments ought to be, try to find a way to insulate that from the vagaries of the political process and do it in a kind of a cost-effective way. So I'll conclude there, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes?
Do you think there's any reason why oil-producing countries would increase production as a result of us putting in place a carbon tax? So maybe they perceive a transition away from oil, and does a carbon tax take that into account when deciding the correct amount?
Yeah, so if we put in a carbon tax that was very rapidly increasing, we could have the perverse result that energy producers accelerate their production of fossil fuels because they know demand will be lower in the future because you've got a tax going up really quickly. So to avoid this unintended consequence of accelerating fossil fuel consumption, you want your tax to go up at a modest rate so that they don't benefit from accelerating the extraction of the resource. That's one thing that might pertain to your question. The other thing that might pertain to your question is if the U.S. cuts back its demand for fossil fuels, traded fossil fuels, and that means particularly oil, and we shift back our demand, the world price of oil could drop a little bit. And those who are not engaged in similar environmental measures could benefit from those lower prices and actually increase their consumption relative to what they otherwise would have done. And that's why you need a coalition of large countries to jointly reduce their demand for those fuels so you don't inadvertently create this price-based leakage of emissions abroad. Yes?
Yes. I know that for trying to bring about balance and sustainability, particularly a trade balance, I know Mr. Pickens has talked about converting vehicles to nat gas, but on the clean energy side, I'm kind of intrigued with the idea of kind of mandating, and I think you briefly mentioned that. And one of the things, we have thousands of existing dams that could be converted to hydro. We have some new energy technologies. But one of the things that Europe has done, well, in addition to the mandates, like the Germans mandated the clean air, the solar panels, one thing is cogeneration. And we only co-use or use downgraded, for those that don't know, downgraded energy about 15% of the time. Most of Europe is over 50%. Mm-hmm. They find waste rather than expelling in the atmosphere the waste heat. And what about the idea of tying a mandate with like a public-private partnership? In other words, some of that free money coming out of the Federal Reserve maybe could go to these things, and then you could just say, well, 1 cent per kilowatt hour or something comes back to pay it. So you do, well, I think Canada's done, so that's my specific question.
Yeah, so I've looked at like the feed-in tariffs that they've adopted in Germany, and they have one, so basically these are guaranteed rates of return for investors in certain renewable electricity generation. And in general, those are vastly less efficient than just pricing the thing you don't want. Because what you're trying to do is induce ratepayers to pay for these technologies. There might be much cheaper ways to reduce emissions, including energy efficiency, right? So, and if my concern is the environment, I don't really care about solar versus wind versus geothermal versus energy and efficiency. the market should take care of this. We shouldn't say, oh, solar, you guys, you get the rate of return you need, and ratepayers will make it good. Instead, say, okay, you guys, fossil fuel users, pay the full freight of the social costs of what you're doing, and then the renewables and the energy efficiency will follow because they'll be more competitive. We don't have to decide which one should win. The market can decide which one wins. We just got to be sure that the prices of these fossil fuels reflect the damages you care about. Yes?
The pie charts that you were showing, where 42% is coal, that's a pie chart of the sources of making electrical power.
That's electricity.
Therefore, 1% for petroleum does not reflect the amount of petroleum that is used for energy to make our cars go.
No. My point was that if you care about energy security, what is it you care about? Leave aside electricity, because all of our electricity fuels are domestic or North American. If what you're worried about is what we import, it's oil. And that is a transportation story. And that's why I have all those examples of what you can do about oil, biofuels, fuel economy, that sort of stuff. And that's where all that comes in.
As a follow-up.
Sure.
On the same pie chart where you showed nuclear and solar, Wall Street Journal today had an announcement from Siemens, Germany, that they're writing off 213 million euros to get out of the solar business and to get out of the nuclear business. Two different.
Right.
So therefore that pie chart will change.
Well, that pie chart is for the United States.
Yeah,
So if I was going to do the pie chart for Germany, it would look very different. And certainly if they change their policies around renewables or anything else, that would shift their pie chart in a certain way. Yeah, but there's a lot of debate about nuclear and its role in electricity generation in Germany. And if they back out of nuclear and they don't want to increase their emissions, they're going to have to figure out how to do that, because that's a fair amount of their kilowatt hours that they have to replace if they do that. Back there.
Yes, ma'am. One of the problems with nuclear power is the handling of the spent fuel problem. Can you say something about the status of reprocessing programs in the United States?
Well, I guess what I would say about nuclear, and there's way more expertise on nuclear waste in this campus than exists at the Brookings Institution. But what I will say is that the waste is one impediment to nuclear power. Right now, I'd have to say economics is probably the bigger impediment. Nuclear power plants, very high capital cost. Now, and also, what people forget, it might take 10 years to build a nuclear power plant. That's a lot of capital to have tied up before you've produced 1 kilowatt hour of rate-paying electricity, right? So just the economics of that, I think, are a big impediment, particularly when we've got the natural gas prices that we do now and the relatively low cost of capital necessary to generate those kilowatt hours with natural gas. So, I mean, it's not to say I think nuclear has no future, but I would say my impression is that you need a pretty high price on carbon to get nuclear into the electricity generation in a big way, from what I've seen about the economics. Do you want to follow up?
Well, the question was about spent fuel reprocessing program.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it.
Because that's, that's what
I mean,
the French
I would
do.
just say incorporate that in the overall cost of nuclear. I mean, whatever the costs are associated with spent fuel and the need to reprocess it or do something with it, that should be incorporated in whatever the cost of nuclear power is, and it should be borne by the folks who use nuclear electricity and not brought by taxpayers, in my view. Internalize all those costs. Yeah? Yes?
But isn't it impossible to determine who's using nuclear power as opposed to who's using wind power, because once it's on the grid, we can't measure it. I mean, we can tell how much power is produced at the plant,
Right.
but we can't say Nevada is using more nuclear power or less nuclear power and using more wind or less wind.
Well, the grid is a complicated animal, and there are different regions of grids, and different parts of the country are under different regulatory regimes from their state public utility commissions. And believe me, these public utility commissions know a lot about the cost of generation of electricity because they regulate the rates that then get passed on to the electricity customers. So in one sense, you're right. Electricity is kind of fungible. But if you have a price on carbon, all else equal, you're going to steer electricity generators to lower carbon sources to meet demand and induce customers to invest in energy efficiency as well. So all those prices will be revealed, and that will be an issue the state PUCs would have to pass those prices through to customers as well. Yes?
You seem to be undisturbed about petroleum because you were looking at
in electricity.
In electricity, yes. But what about the use of energy in industry, including agriculture? For example, that's very intensive on petroleum, and also transportation. I mean, I'm echoing what he said, but if you think the oil is going to run out in, say, 40 years, and nearly all in country after country, oil production is declining.
Except for the U.S. at the moment. But yes, I know what you mean.
Moving out to deeper and deeper waters.
So the question is, as a public policy matter, what is it exactly that you care about? Is there some way in which oil prices don't fully reflect the cost to society of that oil? And as long as you've dealt with the environmental issues, what is it I'm supposed to be concerned about exactly? I mean, if oil prices go up and agriculture's oil intensive, then food prices will go up. We've seen that already. Corn prices and soybean prices go up when oil prices go up. Some of that is through linkages of biofuel markets as well. But that's true of every input, right? If the price of copper goes up, stuff that has copper in it goes up, right? And we don't spend a lot of public policy energy around, dealing with that. So the question is, if you're going to have interventions by the government in the market, be crystal clear about what you're trying to solve and find that cheapest way to do it. And so I am worried about oil, but I'm worried about oil because of the things that the market gets wrong in oil, which primarily is environmental stuff. But there are other market failures around driving, traffic congestion, that sort of thing, that you want to deal with as a public policy matter too. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned briefly carbon storage or carbon sequestration. Yep. Is that considered to be economically viable?
Not at a zero price of carbon, right? Why would anybody in their right mind go to the expense of stripping CO2 out and pumping it underground? Now, there is a market for CO2 in injecting into wells to get them to produce more oil, to pressurize certain kinds of resource mineral extraction, okay? But aside from that, nobody's going to do it unless there's a reason to do it. Either they're required by a regulation or they're induced by a price signal. And in fact, people even stopped doing research on it because cap and trade legislation died. There's no particular prospect of an economy-wide effort to control greenhouse gases. So why would you even invest in the research on it right now? I mean, several projects have fallen through. Follow up?
Yeah, can you explain a little bit further as to the failure of cap and trade? I mean, you champion a carbon tax, and they're somewhat similar.
Yeah, so it was a long story. When the economy was better, and people were, sincerely grappling with the idea of climate change. There was a bill that passed the House. It was a monster bill, and cap and trade was only part of it. It had a whole bunch of other regulations in it. That passed in 2008, the House. There was a companion bill in the Senate that got out of committee, but by that time, it was 2009, we'd had the devastating collapse of financial markets and the Great Recession. And who wanted to be the guy championing higher energy prices at that point? And the opposition successfully labeled it a job-killing energy tax, and that was it. Okay? So, given that experience, I don't see any momentum for cap and trade at any time in the future. So then the question arises, what's the alternative? And so I've been working on looking at a carbon tax in the context of reducing the deficit and doing other tax reforms, because you could use that revenue to fund deficit reduction or other taxes reformed. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first is about energy efficiency retrofits you had on your slide that could work, and I'd like you to expand on that. And then the second question is, if a tax is imposed on the energy producers, that the incidence of that is ultimately going to be passed on to the consumers, and that's going to lower their disposable income and reduce economic prosperity in the country. So the question is it a way to balance that by investing in the infrastructure of the electricity grid so that homeowners can be net producers of electricity through solar panels on their own units and able to sell that to the utility versus just getting credits on their bills?
Okay, so let me take different parts of your question. So the low-income households and energy efficiency retrofits, in the stimulus, there was some components, and we already have low-income energy-related programs, and that was amplified in the stimulus. And my own view, as stimulus, that was relatively good because you helped the low-income folks to have lower energy bills. That made them better off. And who was it you were employing? Construction worker types, right? People going in there doing kind of retail construction. That was your unemployed pool of workers. So you were creating the kind of labor demand that you needed in that context. So I thought of all the energy-related stimulus, that seemed to me to be one of the better designed ones. Now, separate question is, yes, if you impose a tax on carbon, that's going to hit poorer households harder as a share of income than richer households. It is a regressive tax. Now, how regressive it is depends on how you measure it. But so as part of that policy, you want to think about what do you want to do to hold those lowest income households harmless. And we just did some recent calculations that'll be coming out in a paper later. And you can reserve a fairly small share of that carbon tax revenue that could go to, say, shoring up the social safety net programs that might otherwise be cut in a budget cutting or a deficit cutting scenario, or doing something else that targets that revenue to low-income households. What you don't want to do is directly subsidize energy bills, right? Because then you're just blunting the whole incentives you just created. What you want to do is help those households in a way that's neutral to energy and shores them up without undermining your objective. So I guess we have to stop there, but I'm happy to stick around afterwards if anybody wants to chat.
Thanks, Adele. Appreciate that. Thanks to all of you. I should have added at the front of the lecture that, as you see from our colleagues here, we record our lectures and they're up on our website. So in about a week or 10 days, the video of the lecture will be up as well as Adele's PowerPoint. So you'll be able to make reference to any of the slides and data that you saw. And our next lecture is next week, Thursday though, November 1st. And we thought before the election, you might enjoy a lecture on happiness. As opposed to after the election, I guess. I don't know. That depends. I guess that depends, right?
We'll be happy because there'll be no more ads.
You don't work at a TV station, right? But we'll invite, Carol Graham will be back. She spoke last year to a packed house, and her talk is if you'll forgive me, a serious look at the concept of happiness as an economic macro factor in global economies. And she's working with the National Science Group as well as the United Nations on this topic. She's written a book that's getting a lot of press on it. So I hope you can join us. It'll be next Thursday at 6 p.m. And we'll be here for a while to follow up on any questions you still have. Thank you.